The story of Karamdin and his three daughters, the curse of silence. In a small village surrounded by rice fields and the arid winds of the desert, there lived a man named Karamdin. He was neither wealthy nor well educated, but the love he carried for his three daughters was enough to illuminate an entire lifetime. His wife had passed away early. Her death was like a silent knife, cutting deep into his heart, leaving a void no joy could ever fill. Yet Karamdin did not crumble. He chose to live wholly for his daughters, as if, in their every smile and every breath, the soul of his late wife continued to live on. The three girls grew up like three blossoms in a barren garden. The eldest was gentle like the evening sun. The second, sweet as morning dew. And the youngest Zainab was a flickering flame, burning quietly in the dark, carrying a strange wisdom as if she had lived many lives before. Zainab had deep, observant eyes, always watching the world with a caution far beyond her years. She would often sit in silence, listening to the wind, watching the kitchen smoke rise, and sighing whenever strangers entered their home. The first stranger to disrupt their peaceful life was a widow. She came uninvited, unannounced, simply showing up, again and again, to borrow fire whenever the girls cooked for their father. Fire, the symbol of life, of connection. But Zainab sensed something cold and unsettling in the woman, even though she always wore a wide smile. "Sister," Zainab whispered as she tugged her elder sister's sleeve after the widow left, "I don't like that woman. Something about her feels wrong. She doesn't need fire, she came to take away our peace." Her sisters chuckled gently. "Sweet little one, she's just a poor old woman. Everyone grows old, frail, and in need of help. The Buddha teaches us compassion." Zainab lowered her eyes. She loved the Buddha's teachings, but her instincts told her otherwise. There was something ominous hiding in the widow's visits, in the way she never made eye contact. What Zainab didn't know was that fate, sparked by a single borrowed flame, was about to burn down everything they knew. Then one day, their father's food tasted spoiled. A bitter, ashen flavor crept into every grain of rice, every spoonful of soup. Karamdin frowned but said nothing. "They're still young," he told himself. "Maybe the cooking just needs practice." The next day again. And then again. One night, he hid behind the curtain. He saw his daughters preparing every dish with care and cleanliness. Everything was perfect, until the familiar widow crept in, unaware of his watchful eyes. While Zainab tensed with suspicion, her sisters remained kind, allowing the woman to take fire as usual. Only this time, after taking the glowing ember, the widow leaned over the soup pot, and dropped ash into it. In that moment, Karamdin's heart shattered. Not just because the food was ruined, but because trust, like a fragile thread, had been cut. He couldn't understand why a woman once shown kindness would poison his family's peace. The next morning, he invited her into his home. Burning with grief and anger, he planned to confront her, to cast out the darkness that had crept in. But the cunning often understand human hearts better than anyone. The widow showed no shame. She stepped forward, gently placed a hand on his chest, and spoke with honeyed softness. "I only wanted to test you to see if you truly loved your daughters, and you've proven that your love is real. So real, you never once doubted them, even when harmed. I admire you." Even Karamdin, usually firm, was not immune to such sugar-coated deceit. He had lived lonely for so long, starved of feminine softness. And those words, though false, pierced right through his most tender vulnerability. Soon after, he married her. The daughters barely had time to react. Their father's once undying love was suddenly clouded by the shadow of a stranger. Zainab stood at the doorstep, watching her father hold the hand of a woman she instinctively knew was dangerous. And silently, for the first time in her life, she felt the darkness had not only knocked at their door, it had stepped inside. Ever since the widow became the official wife of Karam Din, the little house once filled with the laughter of 3 daughters grew quiet. The sunlight on the old lime walls no longer felt warm, and the fire in the kitchen, once a symbol of unity, now flickered cold and dim. That woman, now their stepmother, no longer hid the disdain in her eyes. She no longer needed to ask for fire. She now owned the kitchen, the house, and the heart of a blind father. The change came so quickly that the 2 older sisters couldn't see it coming. Only Zainab, ever observant, remained aware, her eyes sharp, her heart awake. Yet even she felt helpless as their father grew tired and foggy under the widow's false tenderness. From now on, the stepmother declared one gray morning, cooking, cleaning, washing, it's all your job. My daughter and I won't be serving anyone. No one replied. The elder sisters bowed their heads in silence. Zainab clenched her fists until her knuckles turned pale. The fire in her eyes didn't go out, but it began to smolder with a new kind of pain. From that day on, the 3 girls became shadows in their own home. By day, they worked like servants. By night, they huddled together under moonlight, sighing into the still air. They still called the woman mother, but the word no longer carried any sanctity. A true mother doesn't starve her children. She doesn't replace care with cruelty. The stepmother's daughter, always dressed in fine clothes, her hair done up, lips pink and proud, walked about like a little empress. She looked at the 3 girls with a mix of pity and triumph. Meanwhile, Zainab and her sisters wore patched up rags, ate leftovers, and searched through a tattered cloth bag when they coughed, hoping to find medicine. Zainab became her sister's strength. No longer just the youngest, she was now the last clear voice in a house that had lost its way. One day, after seeing her sisters cry in the kitchen from their stepmother's scolding, Zainab sat between them and whispered, "We can't go on like this. Every day here cuts into our memory of mother like a blade. I think we need to leave. Even for a while. Somewhere far. Just to remember who we are." No one objected. So the 3 girls with worn-out sandals and fractured hearts left home one gloomy afternoon. They didn't know where they were going. Only that they needed freedom more than food. Their feet led them to the edge of a forest where the grass grew thick, and the air hung heavy like tears falling through sunlight between the leaves. They sat beneath a massive tree, perhaps one that had witnessed more lost souls than any human ever could. And there they wept. They cried like they never had before. Not just from hunger or scolding, but from the ache of loneliness, long buried without a name. Zainab looked up, tears running down her face. She whispered in despair, "Mother, if you were still alive, you'd never let us end up like this. We're just daughters, why do we deserve such cruelty?" Just then, from a distance, came the soft tapping of a cane on earth. A figure in a flowing silver-white robe, with a long beard and a bamboo staff, walked slowly toward them. It was an old sage, his face lined with age, but his eyes clear as a still lake. He stood silently before the kneeling girls, saying nothing for a while. Then gently asked, "My children, what sorrow has brought so many tears to this forest? Why does the dew this morning fall heavier than ever?" Zainab looked up. She felt no fear. Something in her heart whispered, this man was unlike her father, unlike the world, unlike the stepmother. He was light in a forest with no path. And so, she began to speak. Zainab told everything. Her words flowed like a stream after a long drought. She hid nothing from the death of her birth mother, her father's tender love, to the despair that came when the stepmother entered and turned their home into a kind of hell. She spoke of meals soaked in tears, cold nights without blankets, and the moment they left home like fugitives fleeing the life that once belonged to them. The sage listened in silence, his fingers gently moving along the prayer beads. He didn't interrupt, didn't speak. For the first time in her life, Zainab felt what it was like to be truly heard by someone who listened not just with ears, but with his heart. When her voice faded into silence, the sage gave a soft, compassionate smile. It was the kind of smile that seeped through morning mist, not loud, but warm enough to melt a frozen soul. "My children," he said, his voice deep and soothing like the earth itself, "sometimes suffering is the shortest path to truth. Had the cruel stepmother not arrived, would you have ever left that house? And had you not left, would we be speaking here today?" The three girls looked at one another, shaken. Could it be true, as the old scriptures say, sorrow is the door through which understanding enters? The sage rose, tapping his staff lightly against the ground. He pointed beyond the trees. "Behind my little hermitage stands a pomegranate tree. It is unlike any other. Its flowers and fruit grow not from soil but from compassion. You are hungry not only for food, but for faith. Go there. Eat until you are full. Then return. Everything will be different." Timidly, the girls followed him. The forest around them softened. Even the wind through the leaves seemed to hush to a whisper. Then, like a miracle, they arrived at a humble thatched hut. And there it was, just as he said, a pomegranate tree heavy with deep red fruit, each one glowing in the golden dusk. "How strange, why are there so many?" the second sister murmured. Zainab didn't reply. She stepped forward and picked one. Its skin was soft like silk, the seeds inside red as living blood, but blood without pain, only life. She took a bite. The sweetness spread in her mouth, not sugary, but a sweetness like release, like being forgiven by life itself. Her sisters followed, picking their own. The three sat together, eating in silence, tears rolling down their cheeks for reasons even they couldn't name. Perhaps the fruit had washed away years of buried shame. They ate until they were full, not too much, but enough. Then they returned to kneel and thank the sage. He said nothing, only smiled and offered one warning. "Come whenever hunger calls. But remember, only a pure heart will find the fruit. If one day you come with greed or hatred in your heart, the tree will vanish." They nodded. From that day on, whenever they were starved, the three sisters would quietly sneak into the forest to visit the tree. Each time, the fruit was ripe and sweet like a mother's love, returned in a second form. They stopped eating the food from their stepmother. They no longer feared hunger. And strangely, their health, their skin, their eyes began to glow with an otherworldly light. The stepmother noticed first. She looked at her own daughter, well-fed and finely dressed, yet pale and sickly. Meanwhile, her husband's daughters, undernourished and overworked, looked radiant and strong. What are they eating? What are they drinking? Why are they blooming while I do everything to wilt them? She couldn't take it anymore. One morning, after watching the girls leave the house, she ordered her daughter to secretly follow them. The girl, small and slender, tiptoed behind her stepsisters. Along the path, Zainab heard footsteps, turned around, and caught the younger girl's gaze. In those eyes there was no hatred, only curiosity. "She's following us," Zainab whispered. "She's just a child," the eldest said. "Don't resent her. She's never done us wrong." "That's exactly why," Zainab replied with a sad smile, "I'll share the fruit with her. So she'll understand, not all things that shine are frightening, and not all darkness needs to be fought with hate. The three sisters turned around and gently called the girl out of hiding. They offered her a pomegranate. She hesitated, then took a bite. Her eyes widened, almost to tears. The next day, she told her mother everything. The stepmother turned pale, not because her daughter had eaten the fruit but because she understood, she had lost. Not to the tree but to the light that springs from compassion, forgiveness, and faith, things no malice can ever destroy. That night, the stepmother could not sleep. She lay on her embroidered silk sheets, her body limp like melting wax under the flicker of a dying oil lamp. But inside her raged a storm. No one knew, but in her heart, the hatred toward the three girls was not just jealousy. It was the terror of confronting something she could not control. What do they have that the heavens protect them so? Fire couldn't harm them. Hunger couldn't break them. Even hatred couldn't make them ugly. Jealousy slithered through her veins like a venomous serpent. By dawn, she could bear it no longer. She summoned a group of men from the village, pulled out a thick wad of money, and commanded coldly, "There's a pomegranate tree in the forest. Uproot it completely. Bring back the roots. Whoever does it well, will be rewarded handsomely." No one asked why. Money has its own reasons. And so the tree that had nurtured three tender souls was hacked down without mercy. Its roots burned, its leaves buried in black mud. A miracle crushed under the heels of man. That evening, as usual, the three sisters carried their baskets into the forest. But when they arrived, they froze. There was no tree. No more fruit. Only a patch of cracked earth, like a shattered mirror. The ground smelled of ash and blood, a scent familiar in sacrificial rites. If you're still watching this video and feel a connection with Zainab and her two sisters, please comment the number 2 below to let me know you're here. And if you haven't subscribed yet, I encourage you to hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell, so you won't miss any of our videos. Your support helps us keep creating meaningful content to inform and inspire you. The eldest fell to her knees, sobbing into her hands. The second clung to her sister's arm. Zainab stood still, silent. There was no rage on her face, only quiet pain, as if all the tears had already been cried within her soul. "Why?" she whispered. "We did nothing wrong." The wind screamed through the forest. The leaves no longer whispered, they howled. And then something unexpected happened. The sage stepped out from the thatched hut, his face calm. He didn't look at the ash or the broken ground. He looked only at the girls with eyes kind and vast like the ocean. "You grieve over a tree," he said. "But remember, what is born from goodness can never truly die. It merely changes form." Zainab broke down in tears. She dropped to her knees. "We're hungry, and hopeless. We have nowhere left to turn." The sage said nothing. He only tapped the ground lightly with his bamboo staff and pointed to an empty space nearby. "Look closely." The girls turned. At first, there was only dry dirt. But within seconds a stream of milky white water began to flow from nowhere, smooth and soft like a ribbon of silk through the ancient forest. "This is the stream of faith," he said. "Only those who've endured hunger and cold, yet still held on to compassion, can see it." From his robe, he pulled out 3 simple clay bowls, humble, like the girls themselves. "Drink. Not to be full but to remember, suffering is only the shell. Inside, is life." The girls said nothing. They bowed low, filled their bowls with the ivory liquid, and drank slowly, afraid to disturb the sacredness of the moment. The taste wasn't sweet or rich like human milk. It was a cool purity like a mother's embrace, like light seeping into the darkest corners of the heart. From that day, the stream became their secret refuge. Whenever they were starved, they returned quietly, sat by the white water, sipped a few mouthfuls, and went home as though pain had never touched them. And strangely, the more they drank, the more radiant they became. The village began to whisper, Karam Din's daughters aren't they starting to look like beings from another world? The stepmother burned with jealousy. Again, she ordered her daughter to follow the girls. The girl sneaked after them and this time, saw everything. Zainab caught her. She spun around, eyes sharp as a blade. What are you doing here? But the second sister intervened. Zainab, don't you understand? She's just a child. She's not the enemy. She's curious. Zainab lowered her head. She sighed, then reached for another bowl, filled it, and handed it to her stepsister. Drink. And forget the poison your mother taught you. The girl drank. But the next morning history repeated itself. She told her mother everything. The stepmother lost her mind. She could no longer stand the truth that all her schemes of fire, of hunger, of deceit were shattered by love and compassion. I will erase every trace of that miracle. And thus another dreadful scheme was born. That afternoon, the stepmother sat in her room, her eyes red and wild like someone slipping into madness. Her only daughter, the one she had favored above all, had now been tainted by the sacred milk shared by her 3 stepdaughters. You drank it too, she screamed. I didn't know, it just felt cool, gentle. I've never tasted anything like it, the girl whispered. The stepmother's hand trembled not out of anger toward her daughter, but out of fear. Fear that her power built on lies and control was beginning to crumble. That very night, she summoned a group of village men. No bargaining, no hesitation. She scattered money like salt on scorched soil. There's a small hut in the forest, she said coldly. Near a stream white as milk. Burn it all. Bury the stream. If you see the old man in the hut, chase him away, or kill him. I don't care. No one asked questions. Money leads, morals follow. And so, the fire was lit. Not the fire of a kitchen hearth, but the fire of destruction. By dawn, the 3 girls rushed into the forest as usual. But this time, the path was choked with smoke. The ground sizzled with heat like the wails of wronged spirits rising from the earth. The hut was gone, reduced to ashes. The white stream vanished beneath foul, muddy sludge. Nothing remained but charred wood and embers still glowing with ruin. Zainab stood frozen. She didn't cry. Her hands clenched, fingernails cutting into her palms until blood surfaced. The clarity in her eyes was gone, replaced by a sorrow that refused to be broken. They've destroyed something sacred, the eldest whispered. No, Zainab replied. They didn't destroy anything. Because the sacred doesn't live in trees or water. It lives inside us. They turned back. No one spoke along the way. But their footsteps had changed, slower, heavier, yet more resolute. As if each step was a silent vow, we will not surrender. When they reached home, the stepmother stood at the gate. From now on, you're not allowed to set foot outside, she declared coldly. And don't expect to eat. Let's see how long you last. Zainab looked up, meeting her gaze. We have eaten compassion. We've drunk forgiveness. Do you really think hunger can starve that out of us? The stepmother slapped her so hard her face turned sharply to one side. But Zainab didn't cry. She didn't flinch. She simply stared at the woman, her eyes calm, as if seeing a soul abandoned in its own darkness. That night, the stepmother moaned in bed, feigning sickness. She told her husband, "My head feels like it's going to explode. No medicine can help. There's only one way left." Karam Din, alarmed, pleaded, "Tell me, what is it? I'll do anything. The pomegranate root is gone. The milk stream is no more. But there's something stronger." She leaned in, whispering darkly into his ear. "Kill your daughters. Take their blood. Smear it on my forehead and palms. I'll be healed. I swear." Karam Din was paralyzed. His eyes widened, his body stiffened like stone. At that moment, for the first time in years, he heard a voice from deep within. The voice of his late wife, echoing from a dream. "Karam, are you still there, father?" He said nothing. Silently, he stepped out of the house. His footsteps dragged toward the graveyard, toward a moss-covered tomb surrounded by wild grass. He knew there was only one place his daughters would go back to, where their mother lay. And he was right. The three girls were sitting there under the cold moonlight, beside the gravestone of their true mother. They didn't know their father was watching. Didn't know he was weeping. Didn't know he was finally awakening. Karam Din stood there a long time, still beside the mossy grave. The night grew cold, the wind from the fields whispering through the graveyard, carrying mist and the scent of damp earth. But he didn't feel cold. His heart burned not with anger, but with a shame so deep it touched his bones. Before him sat his daughters, his own flesh and blood, huddled together like three bent twigs weathering a storm. They didn't speak. They had no idea he was near. But in that sacred silence, something divine was stirring. Awakening. Karam Din stepped forward. He made no sound. But within him, a cry rose louder than temple bells in the night. "I am a failure. A father who did not protect his children. But is it too late to begin again with whatever part of me remains human?" As he neared them, the eldest looked up stunned. The second sister gasped. But Zainab only bowed her head deeply. "Father." Just that one word and he broke down. No longer holding anything back, he fell to his knees, embracing his daughters for the first time in years. His arms trembled, weak, but filled with 1,000 apologies that words could never speak. "I was wrong," he sobbed. "My daughters, please forgive me." Zainab didn't answer. She rested her head on his shoulder. Silent, but forgiveness had already begun the moment he walked out of that house to find them. Before dawn, Karam Din led his daughters deep into the forest. They carried nothing but a clay pot, a few old sweet potatoes, and tears not yet dry. They went far, far from the village, far from the graveyard, far from where the stepmother could ever reach. In the forest, he built a small mud hut, thatched with dry leaves, beside a towering tree. He kindled a fire with rotted wood and prepared a simple soup with his own hands. Then he called his daughters over. "Eat. It's not much, but it's all I have left." The three girls sat down. They ate like they'd never eaten before, not from hunger, but because this was the first meal flavored with real love. Afterward, they fell asleep beneath the great tree. Zainab rested her head on her eldest sister's arm. The second sister gently pulled a scarf over them, the same scarf their father had brought. And Karam Din, he sat still, not sleeping. His eyes lingered on them, trying to etch that moment deep into his soul. And then he left. Without warning. Without a word. All he knew was this: if he stayed, he could not protect them. If he returned empty-handed, the stepmother would suspect. He needed a lie to save the truth. Back at the house, the stepmother still lay writhing in fake pain. "Is it done?" she hissed as Karam Din walked in. "Yes," he said quietly, tossing a bottle of dark red liquid onto the floor. "Their blood." Her voice trembled with glee. "Their blood," he replied, not meeting her eyes. She let out a mad, delighted laugh. Dipping her fingers into the red liquid, she smeared it across her forehead and palms, breathing heavily. "I feel better than ever." Karam Din sat down like a lifeless shell. But deep inside, he exhaled a quiet breath of relief. At the very least, his daughters were still alive. The next morning in the forest, the three girls awoke but their father was gone. Zainab sat still. She didn't cry. She quietly gazed at the sunlight filtering through the leaves and whispered, "Father has left again. But this time, not to abandon us, but to save us." The sky was high and silent. The wind rustled gently, almost like a lullaby. For the first time in months, they felt no fear even in the heart of the wilderness. Zainab stood up, her gaze firm. "From now on, we live for ourselves. And for all the things Father never found words to say." If you're still watching this video and feel moved by Zainab's story, please comment the number 8 below to let me know you're here. And if you haven't subscribed, I invite you to do so and click the bell icon so you don't miss any videos. Your support helps us continue to create meaningful and inspiring content for you. The forest became the sisters' new home. No one knew of their presence in that quiet corner of nature, only wind, insects, and moonlight spilling across cold stones. They lived on gathered firewood, wild vegetables near the stream, and fragments of memories from a house that once held warmth. Zainab, though outwardly calm, carried the deepest fractures. Because she understood, evil doesn't stop just because you walk away from it. One afternoon, while her two sisters were out collecting wood, Zainab stayed behind to tidy up their small shelter. Dusk had begun to fall when a knock came at the door. She jumped. Deep in the forest, who could possibly know this place? Zainab opened the door slightly. An old man stood before her, long white beard, a green robe, a curious glint in his eyes, and a faint smile on his face. "Greetings, child. I'm a pilgrim, hungry and thirsty. Could you spare a little something to eat?" Zainab hesitated. But then, remembering what it meant to be turned away, she nodded and invited him in. She offered the last bit of thin porridge they had and motioned for him to sit. In her heart, she thought of the sage who had once saved her. Perhaps kindness should never be closed off. The old man ate in silence. But his eyes weren't normal. They pierced through her skin, her modest clothing, the memories she had tried to bury. Suddenly, as she turned to fetch water, he spoke. "You are very beautiful. I have never seen such beauty in the wild." Zainab turned back, stunned. "Excuse me? What did you say?" His face shifted. No longer kind. Now cold, like a beast stalking its prey. "Don't pretend to be innocent. I am a man of power. I can give you everything: riches, immortality, dominion. All I ask is that you become mine." Zainab stepped back. Her heart pounded. Every sense screamed in warning. "I have a husband. And I am the mother of a child," she said firmly. Then, the old man sneered, "I shall turn you into something your husband will never recognize." Before she could react, he threw a handful of black powder into the air, chanting strange, hissing words like a snake's breath. And then, Zainab's body began to contort. Her limbs shriveled. Her hair fell to the floor. Her mouth opened to scream, but only a long, sorrowful howl came out. When the pain subsided, she realized she was crawling on all fours. She looked down. Her hands were now claws. Her mouth could no longer speak. Her chest no longer a mother's. Her face was the face of a dog, with a rope looped tightly around her neck. The old man, now revealed as a cruel sorcerer, laughed maniacally, dragging Zainab out of the hut like an unnamed animal. At that moment, Zainab's son, now 3 years old, was sleeping under a tattered blanket. Suddenly, he jolted awake and screamed as if he had just heard his mother's final cry from far, far away. His aunts rushed back and found the hut empty. The boy was shaking, calling out, "Mama, where's Mama?" Zainab was gone. Darkness fell over the forest, but the thread of motherhood between Zainab and her child had not been severed. From that moment, fate etched a promise into the stars that one day, the child would return to free his mother, and all the souls trapped in the chains of karma. 14 years passed, an eternity when one lives with nameless emptiness. In a small house on the edge of the village, a boy grew up unlike any other. No mother, no father, no lullabies at night, no arms to hold him when the storms came. Only 2 aunts, wounded women trying to stitch happiness together from broken pieces of the past. That boy's name was Ayan, Zainab's son. From early on, Ayan's eyes were different from other children. Deep, sorrowful, and longing for something even he couldn't name. Every night, he had the same dream. His mother, half woman, half beast, chained in a distant, misty place, crying without sound. Her eyes, pleading, reached out to him through the fog. When he woke, Ayan would sit in silence. Some mornings, he wouldn't eat, wouldn't smile. In his heart something beat like a drum calling him home. At 17, on a wind-chilled autumn afternoon, Ayan overheard a hushed conversation between his 2 aunts. "He's grown up. How much longer can we keep this secret? I'm afraid. If he learns his mother was turned into a dog, that his father vanished, and the one who caused it all walks free, what will he do?" We raised him in silence. But his soul, it's never been quiet. The door was ajar. Ayan heard every word like thunder slamming into his chest. He entered the room. His eyes no longer shimmered with youthful wonder. They burned steady like an oil lamp in a storm. "Auntie, where is my mother?" The women froze. No one answered. Because in that moment, they both knew a journey had begun. One that could not be stopped. That night, Ayan packed a few things into an old cloth bag, some dry bread, a flute left by his father, and a silver ring engraved with his mother's name, Zainab, which he always wore. Before leaving, he bowed deeply to his aunts. "I don't blame you. But I cannot go on living without knowing if my mother still exists, or has become one with the wind." He walked away without looking back. The night sky was full of stars, as if the universe itself wanted to witness a young soul begin his journey, to answer the questions a whole village tried to bury. Many days later, Ayan crossed forests, forded rivers, and climbed the same hills where his parents once walked. He didn't know where he was going. He had only his dreams as a map, and the beat of his heart as a compass. One night, in the middle of a desolate rocky forest, Ayan sat to rest beside a moss-covered stone when a voice echoed behind him. "Who are you? And why do you dare step into the land of the forgotten?" Ayan turned around. An old man stood there, thin, with hair white as clouds, wearing coarse robes, leaning on a bamboo staff, just as the 2 aunts had once described the sage long ago. "I am Ayan, son of Zainab," the boy said firmly. The old man's eyes widened. After a long pause, he nodded slowly. I knew you would come one day. Your mother's blood has never stopped calling. The sage led Ayan along a winding path until they reached a stone valley, gray and lifeless, as if sunlight no longer dared to visit. This was once a village of the cursed, the sage said. Cursed by who? Ayan asked. A sorcerer, the one who turned your mother into a beast, and your father and uncle into living statues. His voice grew heavy. Ayan shuddered. As they went deeper, Ayan saw statues strewn everywhere, people frozen mid-cry, mid-run, mid-embrace. The entire space felt like a cemetery without farewell. At last, the sage stopped before a stone chamber, sealed by silver chains. Inside is your mother. Still alive, but no longer in human form. Ayan's breath caught. He stepped forward and placed his hand on the door. Mother. From within, a low moan answered, a sound between a howl and a whimper, part beast, part human. It twisted his heart. The sage placed a hand on his shoulder. To free your mother, you must destroy the thing that anchors the sorcerer's soul. What is it? An emerald parrot. His life force is sealed inside it. It's hidden deep within the forest of shadows, visible only to those with a pure heart. Ayan clenched the ring on his finger. I'll go. For her. And for myself. The sage handed Ayan a small fabric pouch. Inside was a milky white teardrop-shaped stone, the last remnant from the ancient sacred spring. Keep it close. When you face the darkness, place it over your heart. If your heart stays pure, it will light your way. Ayan bowed in gratitude and departed. He had no weapon, no magic, only a steadfast heart and the voice of blood calling from within. The forest Ayan entered was like no other. No birdsong. No wind. No sunlight. Only the dim glow of bioluminescent vines, snaking like serpents over giant tree trunks. The air was thick, like the forest was breathing the fear of whoever dared step in. After hours of walking, Ayan began to see illusions. His mother standing there, frail but beautiful, reaching out to him. He ran toward her, but as soon as he touched the figure, it shattered into smoke. Don't let memories lead you astray, the sage's voice echoed in his mind. Ayan clutched the white stone, placing it over his chest. A faint glow pulsed and the illusions vanished instantly. Beyond the false visions, Ayan encountered the guardian beast of the forest, over 3 meters tall, with a tiger's body, a bird's head, and wings black as midnight. Its fiery eyes burned, and each step made the earth tremble. There was no escape. Ayan knelt. Not to surrender but to pray. If my mother was once spared by compassion, then let me live so I may save her. The beast stopped. In its blazing eyes, something flickered. Ayan raised his hand and removed the silver ring engraved with Zainab, holding it open in his palm. The white stone shone suddenly, casting light upon the ring, then radiating across the forest. The creature roared not in fury, but in anguish, and dissolved into silver smoke, leaving behind a stone gate inscribed with ancient symbols. Ayan understood it would only open if the trial of faith had been passed. He stepped through. Beyond the gate lay a spiraling cavern, descending deep into the earth. The further he walked, the colder the air became. His heartbeat thundered in his chest. Finally he reached a giant moss-covered stone, above which floated a golden cage suspended by chains of flame. Inside the emerald parrot. Its feathers shimmered like gemstones, its eyes gleamed cold blue, and it stared directly at him. I knew you would come, the parrot spoke, not with a bird's voice, but with the voice of the sorcerer himself. Your mother and I are bound by blood. I cursed her for love denied. Do you really think you can sever that? Ayan didn't respond. He pulled out the white stone and hurled it into the fire surrounding the cage. A flash of blinding light erupted, burning through the flame chains. The golden cage plummeted to the ground. The parrot screamed, "No. If I die, your mother will vanish to dust." Ayan stepped forward, removing a bundle of white flowers from his pouch. Inside it, the silver ring engraved with his mother's name, just as the sage had instructed. "No. If I love her with a heart free of hatred, then your curse has no hold." He placed the ring before the parrot. In an instant, its emerald feathers turned gray, then to ash. The entire cave began to tremble. Ayan turned and fled, carrying the final remains of the sorcerer, to return to where his mother had been chained. Back in the stone village, at the door where silver chains had bound her, Ayan touched the stone and it crumbled into silver dust. A shadow burst from within, a she-dog, twisted by magic, dragging chains behind her. Ayan knelt and pressed the ash he carried gently onto her forehead. "Mother, it's me." A flash of radiant light. The beast form receded. The chains dissolved. And Zainab, after 14 years of curse and silence, returned, in her human form, frail but alive. She looked at her son. She didn't ask a single question. She simply embraced him tightly and cried. For the first time, with human tears. After the curse was broken, the skies above the stone valley burst open with light. The gray clouds were torn apart. Wind swept across the statues one by one. The people began to awaken. Ayan's father Nasir opened his eyes first. He collapsed at the sight of Zainab, rushing to her and embracing her tightly. Her brother-in-law, once a lifeless statue, shed tears. The old sage stood from afar, smiling as if fulfilling an ancient promise. When a person finds light within their own darkness, miracles need no permission. They bloom on their own. The villagers who had once been petrified, trapped by curses in a realm of shadows, now stepped back into the world. They walked through the forest, past the streams, like newborn children. No one asked, what happened? They simply knew they had been reborn. Ayan returned to the village with his mother and father. His two old aunts embraced him, sobbing like rain. The three sisters Zainab and her elder siblings were reunited. For the first time in many years, they sat together beneath a shared rooftop, no longer afraid of the sunlight. Zainab walked into the small room that had once been a prison of memories. She touched the old walls, looked at the clay pot, and the cracks now covered with moss. Everything is still here. Only time has drifted far away. She didn't search for the past. She began a new present. As for Karam Din, when he heard his daughter had returned, he nearly fainted. The old man, his hair fully white, his back bent with guilt, fell to his knees before Zainab. "Zainab, I am unworthy. I abandoned you. I believed the wrong people." Zainab lifted him gently. She looked at him with eyes no longer filled with anger or blame, but with the same soft light once seen in her mother's gaze. "Father, if you had never made mistakes, we wouldn't be standing here today. I forgive you. Not because you deserve it, but because forgiveness is the only way my heart can truly heal." Karam Din covered his face and wept like a child. His tears washed away the final traces of a soul once lost. And the stepmother? She was no longer in the village. Some said after Zainab disappeared, she went mad, wandering aimlessly, whispering the names of those she once cast aside. Some saw her holding a piece of driftwood like a daughter, singing lullabies and laughing into the night. One day, she was found dead by the riverbank, her face gray with illness, still clutching a torn, filthy doll. No one held a funeral. The wind carried her body away. No music, no mourning. Those who plant hatred, the sage simply said, are eventually consumed by it. On the day of the village's celebration, Ayan was crowned with an honorary wreath, not because of who his parents were, but because he preserved humanity amid monsters and magic. Zainab looked at her son, her heart overflowing with pride. The child who once called out for her in dreams, had become a torchbearer in the dark. The old sage stood on a hill, watching from above. A child born from shadows, if raised with light, becomes the dawn of the world. Then he turned away. His robe fluttered softly in the wind. No one saw him leave. No one ever knew his name. Only that, from then on, whenever wind chimes rang at night, the villagers would fold their hands and whisper, "Thank you, for guiding us out of the maze within ourselves." Years later, a small school was built beside the new stream where Zainab would sit and tell her story to the children. Ayan opened a classroom there, teaching compassion, faith, and rebirth. Their family's journey became a living legend passed from generation to generation like a sacred reminder. Forgiveness does not change the past, but it saves the future. Thank you for joining us today. We would love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and share something you learned today, and how you plan to carry it into your life. Your voice matters to us. Don't hesitate to share. Reading your comments brings us incredible strength and encouragement. If you found this video meaningful, please like, subscribe, and share it. Your support helps us continue creating content that informs and inspires. Thank you for watching. We look forward to seeing you in the next video.